He only asked once. That was the part that stayed with Nora Calloway long after everything else. Not the screaming, not the lawyers, not the cold silence of the apartment they'd shared for 11 years. Just the way her husband had looked at her across the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, coffee going cold between his hands, and said, "I think we both know this isn't working anymore." One sentence. 11 years. Tuesday morning. She hadn't cried right away. That surprised her later, looking back. She just sat there, feeling the tile floor beneath her bare feet, noticing a water stain on the ceiling she'd never paid attention to before, thinking, is this what the end sounds like? This quiet? Elliot Calloway was not a cruel man in the way people imagined cruel men to be. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw things. He was the kind of man who wore pressed shirts on weekends and always remembered to refill the Brita pitcher. And when he told Nora he wanted a divorce, he said it the same way he said everything. Calmly, clearly, like he'd already run the numbers, and this was simply the most logical conclusion. What he didn't tell her, not that Tuesday, not for weeks, was that he'd already found the conclusion before he ran the numbers. Her name was Priya. Nora found out the way women always found out. By accident, and then all at once. A name repeated in a hotel receipt. A particular softness in his voice during a late call she wasn't supposed to overhear. And then, because the universe apparently had a sense of narrative, a photograph on a colleague's Instagram story. Elliot at a rooftop dinner in Chicago, his hand resting on the small of a woman's back like he'd been doing it for months. Because he had. She signed the divorce papers on a Friday. November. Rain coming sideways against the windows of her attorney's office downtown. Her hand didn't shake, which she was proud of, even though her attorney kept offering her water, and her chest felt like something was slowly compressing it from the inside. The settlement was fair, she was told. The condo went to Elliot. His name had been on the mortgage first. She kept her car, half their savings, and a storage unit full of things she hadn't looked at since the move from Boston. She also kept, without knowing it, something else entirely. She didn't find out until 8 weeks later. The first person she told was her sister Dana. They were sitting in Dana's kitchen in Evanston, the kids asleep upstairs, wine poured and mostly untouched, when Nora set the test on the table between them. Dana stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked up. "Does Elliot know?" "No. Are you going to tell him?" Nora looked out the window at the backyard. The old swing set Dana's husband kept meaning to take down. "I don't know yet." She did know, actually. She just needed another day to let herself know it fully. Elliot Calloway had taken 11 years from her. He had let her believe, for the last 2 of those years, that the reason they couldn't get pregnant was some vague, shared biological misfortune, a timing issue, a stress issue, something ambient and no one's fault. He had sat across from her in a specialist's office and held her hand while the doctor talked about options. And he had sighed in that heavy way of his, and he had said, "I just don't know if the universe wants this for us, Nora." She found the prescription bottle 4 months after she moved out, when she went back to collect the last of her things. It had slipped behind a bathroom drawer, a hormonal suppressant. Prescribed to him, refilled regularly for 3 years. She stood in the bathroom for a very long time. Then she put the bottle in her purse, finished packing her boxes and left. She never told him she'd found it. She didn't call her attorney. She didn't post about it, or send a message or do any of the things that the furious, devastated part of her wanted to do. She simply decided, quietly and completely, that Elliot Calloway would have nothing to do with the life she was about to build. Chicago in winter has a particular kind of loneliness that is different from other cities. The wind off the lake doesn't ask permission, it just arrives. Nora had moved back to Chicago 3 years before the divorce, following Elliot's job at the firm. She had her own work. She was a structural engineer, specializing in building rehabilitation, which meant she spent her days figuring out how to save things that everyone else had already written off. It was, her therapist once noted with a small smile, not an accidental career choice. She was good at it. She'd built a reputation quietly, the way she built most things. Without announcement, without performance, just sustained and careful effort until the work spoke for itself. After the divorce, she threw herself into a project that had been waiting for her attention. The rehabilitation of a 1920s landmark building in the West Loop, a former textile warehouse that a development group wanted to convert into mixed-use residential. It was complicated work. The bones of the building were strong, but a century of additions had created structural conflicts that needed untangling. It was on site during the third week of February that she met Theodore Ashworth. He arrived without announcement on a Thursday afternoon, in a coat that cost more than some people's rent, accompanied by exactly one assistant and no entourage, which told Nora immediately that he was either a serious person or someone performing seriousness very deliberately. He walked the site with the kind of focus that came from actually understanding what he was looking at, asked 2 questions that were better than most people's 12, and then looked at her, not the foreman, not the project lead, and said, "You're the one who figured out the load-bearing solution on the east wall." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "I read your analysis last week. It's the reason we're still considering this project." Theodore Ashworth was not what she'd expected from the name attached to the Ashworth Capital portfolio. He was 43, with gray at the temples, and a directness that she recognized as a particular type of Midwestern, the kind that had been polished by money and travel but not entirely replaced by them. He asked about the structural history of the building, she answered. He listened in a way that people rarely listen, which is to say, without already composing his reply. She didn't think about him again until the following Tuesday, when he sent a message through her firm requesting a direct consultation. She thought about him quite a bit after that. She told him about the pregnancy in March, 3 weeks before she was visibly showing. Because she believed in giving people information they deserved to have before they had to guess at it. She had not intended to tell him. They'd had dinner twice, the kind of dinners that are professionally bounded but personally aware of themselves. But he asked her something direct and she answered it the same way. "You seem like you're carrying something," he said. They were at a small Italian place near her office, nothing impressive, the kind of restaurant that was only good because it had been there for 40 years and never tried to be anything else. "I'm pregnant," she said, and then, because that alone felt incomplete, "My ex-husband doesn't know, and I intend to keep it that way." Theodore Ashworth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is that the right call?" "Yes, okay." He didn't press. He didn't offer opinions she hadn't asked for. He asked how she was feeling physically, whether she had support, whether the project timeline needed to be revisited. Practical questions, delivered without the particular kind of careful gentleness that people used when they were actually managing their own discomfort. She went home that night and thought, this is what a steady person looks like. She had forgotten, somewhere in 11 years, what that felt like. In April, Elliot Callaway's life began its unraveling. It started with a routine audit, his firm's annual internal review, which surfaced a series of transactions that didn't trace cleanly. Client funds moved between accounts in ways that required explanation. Elliot provided explanations. The explanations required further documentation. The documentation raised more questions than it answered. What emerged, slowly, and then all at once in the way these things always did, was that someone had been using Elliot's credentials, his login, his digital signature, his access to client accounts, to route money through a series of holding entities. It was sophisticated. It had been running for almost 2 years. The question of who had done it, and why, would occupy investigators for months. What became clear quickly was that Elliot's name was on every transaction, and in the absence of a compelling alternative narrative, the firm's internal counsel and the external investigators who were brought in shortly after reached the same provisional conclusion. That Elliot Callaway had embezzled nearly $4 million from client accounts and attempted to conceal it through shell entities. He was placed on administrative leave within the week. Nora heard about it from a mutual friend, a text message sent with the particular energy of someone who wasn't sure whether it was good news or bad news to share, but couldn't help themselves. She read it twice. Then she set her phone down and went back to the structural drawings spread across her kitchen table. She felt less than she'd expected to. Maybe nothing. Maybe something so deep it hadn't surfaced yet. She didn't call him. The twins were born on a Thursday in June at 6:42 and 6:51 in the morning. 2 girls. Nora had known since February, had kept that information in the specific private place where she kept things that were only hers. And when they placed both of them in her arms, one after the other, she understood why she had been so protective of the knowing. Because this had always been hers, not a shared revelation, not a negotiated outcome. Hers. She named the first one Iris, for her grandmother. The second one Eleanor, for no reason she could explain except that it felt right, felt like the name the baby had arrived with. Theodore was in the waiting room. He'd driven her to the hospital at 4 in the morning without being asked. Had sat in the plastic chair outside labor and delivery for nearly 3 hours, and when the nurse brought him into the recovery room, he stood at the door for a moment, before he came any closer, like he understood that this space was something he had to be invited into. "They're extraordinary," he said, which was not the most articulate thing he'd ever said to her, but was, she thought, entirely accurate. "Sit down," she told him. He did. Elliot Calloway arrived at the hospital on Saturday morning. He had found out the same way he found out about most things now, late, through someone else, and with the specific disadvantage of having lost the social infrastructure that kept people informed. The mutual friends who used to route information to him had quietly redistributed themselves in the months since the investigation began. He showed up in the lobby with no prior call, no arrangement, wearing the expression of a man who had convinced himself that arrival was the same as right. The nurse at the desk checked his name against the room list. He wasn't on it. He explained that he was the father. The nurse explained that the patient had not listed him as an authorized visitor, and that the NICU had specific protocols regarding access, and that if he had a legal claim, he was welcome to pursue it through the appropriate channels. He said he'd like to speak to Nora directly. The nurse said she'd pass along the request. Nora received the message on her phone, read it, and did not respond. She had 2 weeks before the birth, on the advice of her attorney, reviewed the divorce settlement documentation very carefully. What she had found, tucked into a subsection of the parenting rights addendum, in language so standard it had apparently passed unremarked by both attorneys at signing, was a clause Elliot had insisted on during negotiations. At a moment when Nora had been too exhausted and too heartbroken to interrogate every line, the clause stated that in the event of a pregnancy conceived prior to the finalization of the divorce, any children born of that pregnancy would be subject to the standard custody arrangement outlined in the agreement. The standard custody arrangement, as they had both agreed, assigned primary physical custody to Nora and granted visitation rights to Elliot contingent on his maintaining employment in good standing and residing within a reasonable geographic distance. Elliot Calloway was currently unemployed, under investigation, and had relocated to a corporate apartment in a suburb 45 minutes from the city. Her attorney had flagged the clause. Her attorney had also noted, with careful professional understatement, that even if Elliot chose to contest it, which he likely would, eventually, the process would take time, and in the meantime, Nora had no legal obligation to facilitate contact that wasn't court-ordered. She had time. She had the girls. She had a building she was still saving, which would be beautiful when it was done. The investigation into the missing funds took 6 months. What it eventually revealed, through the work of a forensic accounting firm that had been brought in by the clients whose money had disappeared, was a more complicated story than the one Elliot had been trying to tell. His access credentials had in fact been compromised. Someone inside the firm, a junior analyst named Craig, who had left the company 17 months earlier, with a performance review that Elliot himself had signed, had retained access to certain internal systems through a vulnerability that IT had failed to close. Craig had a relationship, financial and otherwise, with a woman who had, it turned out, been in a long-running dispute with one of the firm's major clients over a separate business matter. The money hadn't gone to Elliot. Elliot had been, in the language of the investigator's final report, an unwitting access vector. It was not quite vindication. The report also noted that Elliot's lack of attention to his own account activity over a period of nearly 2 years had created the conditions for the fraud to go undetected. A negligence that, while not criminal, reflected poorly on his professional judgment. The firm did not offer to reinstate him. They offered a quiet severance and a non-disclosure agreement. He signed it. He was not, in the end, someone who fought when fighting cost him something visible. Nora read the summary her attorney forwarded. She thought about the prescription bottle. She thought about the specialist office, his hand on hers, his voice saying the universe. She closed the document. She saw him once more, unexpectedly, on a morning in October. She was walking with the girls through Lincoln Park, both of them in a double stroller that she had learned to navigate with the confidence of someone who had been forced to learn quickly, and she turned a corner near the conservatory, and there he was. Elliot, in a jacket she didn't recognize, with a coffee cup and the look of a man who had recently learned how to fill his own time. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He looked at the stroller, at the girls. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name precisely and didn't particularly want to. "Nora," he said. "Elliot," she said. They stood there for a moment in the October air. The girls were awake, looking at the trees, entirely unconcerned with the weight of the context surrounding them. "There," he stopped. Started again. "How old?" "4 months," he nodded. He looked at them for another moment. She watched him understand, or begin to understand, the specific dimensions of what he had walked away from. Not just her, but this. The particular irreversibility of 4 months. "I should have," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." And that was the end of it. She pushed the stroller past him and kept walking. Iris made a sound at a passing dog. Eleanor had fallen asleep again. One small fist tucked under her chin. The path curved toward the lake, and the lake was there the way it always was, enormous and indifferent and genuinely beautiful, catching the October light. The West Loop building opened in January. The dedication event was small. Architects, engineers, the development team, a few of the original investors. The building had been named, at the development group's request, the Whitmore, after the original owner of the textile company, whose workers had walked its floors 100 years ago. Nora stood in the lobby and looked up at the restored ceiling. Original tin tile, cleaned and stabilized, and felt the particular satisfaction of having returned something to itself. Theodore found her there, a glass of champagne she hadn't drunk in her hand. "You're thinking about the east wall," he said. "I'm thinking about the ceiling," she said. "But yes, also the east wall." He stood next to her, not too close, in the way he'd learned to calibrate without being told. He was not, she had discovered over the last 8 months, a man who required managing. He was someone who paid attention and adjusted accordingly, which was rarer than it had any right to be. "The girls are with Dana tonight," he said. "Until tomorrow morning. Do you want to get dinner? Somewhere without a project attached to it?" She looked at him. The lobby was full of people in good moods, talking about the ceiling and the windows and the remarkable original ironwork on the staircase. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something comes back. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." She didn't tell the full story for a long time. Not publicly, not even to most of her friends. It didn't seem like a story yet. It seemed like something she was still inside of, still turning over, still understanding the shape of. But she thought about it sometimes, late, after the girls were asleep and the apartment was quiet, and she was sitting at the kitchen table with the structural drawings for the next project spread out in front of her. She thought about the Tuesday morning, the coffee going cold, the water stain on the ceiling. She thought about the prescription bottle and the specialist's office, and the word universe, spoken in a voice designed to sound like grief. She thought about what it meant that the life she had now, the girls, the work, the slow-built thing with Theodore, that didn't have a name yet but didn't need one, had arrived through the door that looked, at the time, like loss. Iris had started smiling, not reflex smiling the way newborns did, but actual smiling, the kind with intention behind it, recognition. She would look at Nora across the length of a room and smile like she was communicating something specific, like she had information and was choosing to share it. Eleanor was more observant. She watched everything, the movement of light across the ceiling, the neighbor's dog through the window, her sister's face. She was building something internally, taking inventory, deciding what she thought. Nora recognized that in herself. The long looking, the deciding. She had decided, somewhere in the last 12 months, that the things that had been done to her did not have the final word on what she became, that the marriage had been a kind of contracted silence she hadn't recognized as silence while she was in it, that the silence was over. The east wall had held. The ceiling was restored. The building was standing, so was she.